I was recently playing the rather excellent Shovel Knight Pocket Dungeon with a buddy and was reminded of the heyday of falling block puzzle games. In the 90s, everyone seemed to have their own favourite. A lot of people loved Tetris, of course, some favoured Dr. Mario, some maniacs preferred Columns. For me, as a Sonic fanatic, I was always partial to Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine. I used to think of it as a fun little distraction, a side entry in the Sonic the Hedgehog series, but on reflection I've completed Mean Bean Machine more times than any other Sonic game. It's addictive and easy to pick up and play, and I think it's basically perfect. Before I dive too deep though in explaining why the game is perfection, here's a brief primer in case you're not familiar with how the game plays. It's simple to explain. Pairs of coloured beans fall from the top of the screen and it's your job to connect a row, column or clump of 4 or more similarly coloured beans together to make them disappear. Each time you do so, a rock will fall on the opponent's screen, which, although it can be removed, is a little pesky. The complexity of the game comes in when you realise you can chain bean matches together. If you're careful, you can unleash a chain reaction where a wave of matches triggers one after another. Depending on how many matches you get in your chain, you'll unleash an avalanche of rocks on your opponent's screen, making life very difficult for them. Of course, the opponent can unleash on you too. The game ends when either you or your opponent places a bean that transgresses the top of the screen. It's simple, but the more you play, the more depth the game reveals. The single player experience sees you taking on a string of Dr. Robotnik's robots before finally taking on Dr. Robotnik himself. Each of the robots has their own unique strategy. The game starts off with Arms, who's pretty easy and doesn't really have a definitive style. The second opponent is Frankly, who will always start off by slamming his beans down quickly to create a block at the bottom of the screen when the round starts. It might encourage a sense of panic in new players. Some enemies favour the strategy of trying to build and unleash one gigantic chain reaction. Others try to get as many matches as possible to overwhelm you with individual rocks. The game is, in its later stages, really difficult, with each new stage being faster than the last and demanding quick reflexes to position beans optimally. At the heart of Mean Bean is the ultimate in terms of balancing risk versus reward. Getting a series of quick, individual matches might be a good strategy. It keeps your screen clean and ensures you don't build up an ugly looking backlog of beans. The problem is, this strategy doesn't pack much punch, and isn't likely to overwhelm some of the game's tougher opponents. One of the robots I find most difficult to beat is Squeal, who kind of looks like a pig on wheels. His primary strategy is trying to overwhelm you by getting constant matches. This strategy is particularly arduous when it's employed by the computer because the game also has a really deplorable knack for knowing where to land a rock so it'll completely ruin your plans. Trying to set up and unleash a chain reaction, on the other hand, might sound like a good strategy, until you realise how hard it is to correctly position beans consistently at the game's highest speed while the opponent sends rocks your way. When you decide to commit to building a big chain is really the crux of what Mean Bean is all about. The game has a great sense of ebb and flow. There'll be times when you're on the brink of destruction, but manage to claw it back. But conversely, there will be times when the opponent looks like a goner, but they pull off a miracle. When your opponent is sweating and nearly defeated, do you turn the screw tighter and try and finish them off, or just focus on playing it safe and hope they whittle away? It's simple enough, but endlessly fun. I'd argue that it's a formula that works perfectly. Of course, if you get tired of taking on the robotic opponents, you can always face a buddy. Find someone of a similar skill level and you'll have mountains of fun trying out every conceivable strategy for victory. It turns out that Mean Bean Machine is actually just a reskin of a 1991 game called Puyo Puyo. If you've played Mean Bean, you've played Puyo Puyo. The two games play exactly the same and many of the graphics, music and sound effects are identical between the two. Puyo Puyo was originally conceived as a puzzle-based spin-off of role-playing game franchise Sorcery Saga, populated by a cast of wacky Japanese characters. Sega worked with Puyo Puyo's original developers Compile on an arcade version of the game and wanted to follow that version up with a Mega Drive port. The port, which was pretty faithful to the arcade version, released in Japan to a warm reception, but Sega felt the game wouldn't appeal to Western audiences. Sega decided to kill two birds with one stone. They reskinned Puyo Puyo to suit Western audiences, and in the process managed to sneak out a stopgap game to appeal to Sonic fans in 1993, between the releases of Sonic 2 and Sonic 3. Genius. Rather uniquely, the game's visuals were based on the 1993 Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog cartoon series. That's the one with the comedic tone, that feels like it was inspired by Ren and Stimpy, where Sonic is voiced by Jaleel White. Dr. Robotnik got a really interesting redesign in this series, being depicted as an overweight, kind of grotesque creature of a villain, always bested by Sonic of course. Mean Bean is the only game to depict Robotnik in this way. The first episode of the show to be produced, though not the first to be aired, was called Super Special Sonic Search and Smash Squad. All of the robots that appear as enemies in Mean Bean Machine actually appear in this episode of the show, though some of the robots' colours are different between the show and the game. The only three robots in Mean Bean to reappear beyond this episode are Coconuts, Scratch and Grounder, who also happen to serve as gatekeepers in Mean Bean Machine. The game gets significantly more difficult after each one of them is defeated. Coconut, Scratch and Grounder are iconic, and it's great that they got to star in a game together along with Dr. Robotnik. Although they're all based on Sonic 2 badniks, so this is kind of a reunion. The inspiration for Coconuts and Grounder is pretty obvious, but Scratch was apparently loosely based on Clucker from Winged Fortress Zone. One more link that Mean Bean Machine has with the cartoon is the game over screen, which you'll probably be seeing quite a lot of because the game's difficult. The screen is based off a scene from an unaired pilot episode of the cartoon series. Now, the reason I bring all of this up is that the reskin isn't just a cool tie-in to the cartoon series. It actually makes for a better game than the original, at least in my opinion. Graphics aren't everything, but when you're looking at two games that are functionally the same, the window dressing suddenly matters a lot more. As well as offering stellar gameplay, I think Mean Bean is more interesting in the audio-visual department than the game it's based on. Yeah, Puyo Puyo's cast are cute, but the legion of robots you take on in Mean Bean are so expressive and full of life. There's nothing worse than doing badly and having to endure your opponent's shit-eating grin. I mean, look at this guy. But of course there's nothing better than finishing an opponent off and witnessing them crumple before your very eyes. The goofy, expressive faces just add another layer of fun to proceedings. Games like Tetris thrive on the idea that you're challenging yourself and your past high scores, but Mean Bean is a distinctly competitive game, and the design team did an awesome job firing up players' competitive spirit by making them want to whoop their opponents. For what it's worth, I think the little enemy portraits and sprites are gorgeous too, and each robot's dialogue and playstyle helps to add a little bit of personality to them. It'd be nice to see some of these guys return someday. I also think Mean Bean's sound design is a step up from Puyo Puyo. The music pieces have been reordered with a few original compositions thrown in, and Mean Bean's level-by-level music progression better suits the increasing intensity of the game. It's no wonder that Mean Bean has such a good soundtrack. It turns out the composers were deeply inspired by Kraftwerk, Germany's greatest musical export, specifically by the song Home Computer. An earlier pre-release version of Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine actually has a 16-bit version of Home Computer as the title screen music. For licensing reasons, this was removed from the final release of the game, but you can still hear Kraftwerk's influence in the final soundtrack. One small detail I also love is the yippee and yeehaw sound effects when you or your opponent pull off a chain. It's just a really satisfying sound and again, superior to Puyo Puyo's original sound effects. Mean Bean also had a Game Gear port, which I also happen to prefer to the Puyo Puyo Game Gear port for all of the same reasons. The Game Gear port is worth a play for diehard fans because each enemy robot has a different set of facial expressions. I dare say, a few are even wackier in this 8-bit version. Robotnik's insane expressions are ripped straight from an Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog model sheet. Look at that face! Now that I've got my love for the game off my chest, there's one thing I always wondered about Mean Bean though. Who exactly do we play as? Puyo Puyo has an actual protagonist who progresses through the story mode, but in Mean Bean a protagonist is never stated. The story is simple enough. Your job is to foil Robotnik's newest plan to stomp out fun on planet Mobius. Robotnik has kidnapped the citizens of Beanville, and starts the process of roboticizing each and every one of them. Your task is to free as many beans as possible and ruin Robotnik's plans in the process. Some buddies of mine would insist that we were playing as Sonic, though Sonic isn't mentioned anywhere in the game. Perhaps we're actually playing as Has-Been, the orange little fella called Carbuncle in Puyo Puyo, who spends his time dancing in the middle of the screen. It's possible, I guess. I always felt like I was actually playing as me. That's how the instruction booklet made me feel anyway. What do you reckon? Before I finish off, it's worth noting that Puyo Puyo also received a Western reskin on the SNES too. The result was Kirby's Avalanche, also known as Kirby's Ghost Trap, a game that plays exactly the same as Puyo Puyo and Mean Bean, but populated by Kirby characters. Of course, functionally it's great fun, but I think the general atmosphere of the game is again inferior to Mean Bean. Since 1999, Puyo Puyo has been a Sega property, and the series is still going strong with recent additions like Puyo Puyo Tetris 2. The newer games add a lot of things like different gimmicky beans, but I don't think they improve the game a huge amount. I feel like Puyo Puyo was a series that got it right first time around. Puyo Puyo Tetris 2 also has a long-winded story mode, but again, I think it's inferior to Mean Bean. I found it a lot more entertaining to see and beat all the little robot fellas, rather than endure endless story and dialogue. Sonic has actually appeared in a few Puyo Puyo games in recent years, which is cool and all, but I think it'd be fun if Robotnik, or should I say Eggman, returned to the series as a playable character. Until that happens, I'll just be content that Mean Bean Machine actually popped up as the second boss of Chemical Plant Zone in Sonic Mania. An awesome moment to say the least. Though Robotnik's Mean Bean abilities have deteriorated over the years, I have to say. Suffice to say, he's a lot easier to beat in Sonic Mania than he is in Mean Bean Machine. If you've not played it before, fire it up and you'll have fun. If you've played it before, well, it's one of those games you can replay endlessly, so how about another round? That's all for today, thanks, and hopefully I'll see you next time.